Hello and welcome to The Connection, where RLDatix's Chief Customer Officer Liz Jones and Medical Director Darren Kilroy are joined by leaders and colleagues from within the healthcare industry. In The Connection, we explore how people and technology in healthcare can come together to create great experiences and support patient safety. We hope you enjoy listening.
Hi there and welcome to this edition of The Connection with me, Darren Kilroy.
And me, Liz Jones.
We're really pleased to have the opportunity this podcast to introduce you to Dan Michelson, who is the new Chief Executive Officer here at RLDatix. We had an opportunity to interview Dan some weeks ago, just as he started his journey with us in the company here, and it was too good an opportunity to miss, really. So this podcast is essentially myself, Liz, and Dan just chewing over his early reflections of his time in the organisation, a bit about where he's been before, and his aspirations for where we go next. And we hope you enjoy listening to that.
And I'm really thrilled to be joined again by my co-host, Darren Kilroy.
Hi there.
And by our Chief Executive, Dan Michelson, our very new Chief Executive. Welcome, Dan.
Well, hi there. So we've had a couple of these conversations so far. So we were at our customer conference last week. I think we had about 462 of our customers in Manchester. And Liz and I went on stage and had a conversation. And I told her the only condition was don't give me any questions in advance and let's just talk.
I know.
So we talked for 20 minutes and it was wonderful. So appreciate the people I've had a chance to meet in just my, 8 days here so far. And have talked to a couple hundred people on our team, gotten deep in terms of one-on-one conversations. Probably had 100 customer conversations at our conference, which was unbelievable. So when you make a transition to a role like this, you want to get as real as you can, as quickly as you can. So this has been a really, really fortunate start for me and super excited.
Yeah, and fortunate for us. And I guess we did do that 20-minute or so conversation on the stage. And at that point, we'd known each other 48 hours and we were left wanting more. And whilst at conference, we were doing some podcasts on The Connection, interviewing all sorts of people about their careers in health and care and trying to get to the nub of this conversation we're having more generally on the podcast, which is how do we ensure that jobs in health and care are the best in the world and that technology has got humanity right through it. And you said something on the stage, which was around bits and bytes versus lives. And I'm going to let you use the phrase, but I guess to start off, to understand your philosophy about what we do and how it affects people would be really interesting for folks listening.
Yeah, I mean, listening, there's different things you could do in your career. Working in healthcare is a privilege because the work you're doing actually can make a difference in people's lives. Doesn't matter if you're on the front line, the back line, or anywhere in between, all that work contributes in a big way. But I think we have to acknowledge that the people on the front lines, especially over the last couple of years, the pressure has been enormous. So anything that we can do to help support the people who support our friends and our family and the members of our community, wow, I mean, that's a big responsibility. And so you need to look at that in a tangible way. So as a software company, I think people can lose track of what a software company actually is. So they can call it a tech company. Well, I mean, let's stop and think about that for a second. So really, what is a company there for and what are they there to do? They're there to help solve a problem. And so it really is all about the domain. And so if you kind of zoom out and you say, well, what are we actually doing as a company? Like, what's the perspective that one should take away if they're thinking about working for the company or they're a customer and they're working with us? The perspective that we need to have is that what flows through our software isn't bits and bytes, it's human lives. And so that's what I shared with people. And it's not a phrase or just a way of saying something. It actually is very, very specific in terms of the work that we're actually doing. So we could talk a little bit about the products that we provide and why it would be easy to make a case that it is actually the work that we're doing in safety and workforce risk and other areas. But we're a company that other people depend on for safe care, for their daily rhythm and their routine of going to work, right? And, when you think about staffing. So you can get lost when you work at a company and thinking that you work in a specific function or you're working on this specific product, and very easy to get caught up in the mundane and sort of lose track of the why. But the why is always more important than the what. The why is what takes the what and it moves it up to the next level. So if you think of really what you will reflect on throughout your career, it's really all about impact. So the impact that you had in terms of the work that you did, the relationships that you built with the people that you worked with, those are the tangible things that bring a sense of pride and purpose to work. And when you have those two things riding shotgun in your car next to you, you're going to be much more driven than you would otherwise. And you'll be able to do not just ordinary things, but extraordinary things.
It's interesting in the space of software and tech and health. One of my reflections has always been that whatever your role is in RLDatix or indeed in the customer base, everyone is affecting human lives. We're all touching, by virtue of what we do, we are actually affecting newborn babies, bereaved families, people having operations, you name it, the whole panoply of healthcare. As you say, it's such a rare privilege, and it's almost a unique scenario to find oneself in, is that we're actually touching human lives through by virtue of what we do. It's almost unique, I think, in roles that one can have.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to ask you a question then. Yeah. So can you just share your clinical background so people have that context? Because then I think I have a follow-up question for you. So Liz, sorry to take over the question.
Not at all. So I was many years in clinical practice as an emergency physician from the early 90s when I first started the journey. And I was your typical rookie junior doctor, just freewheeling and having a great life. And it was all great fun. And technology, all that was in the future. It was pretty rudimentary in that respect. And I was in that space clinically for many years and went through a series of job title changes, promotions and what have you. And I ended up being a board member, C-suite guy for being a CMO, Chief Medical Officer for a big NHS hospital. Right up until the pandemic. And after the pandemic, I came into work in the family at RLDatix. And in that time of clinical practice, I was involved in various national committees and national bodies and movements around psychological safety and wellness at work. And first encountered, as was then the Allocate guys, way back, over a decade ago?
About a decade.
Years ago, as a customer, and got involved in all the software at that stage on the workforce side. Brought it all into the organization I was working in at the time. And we made some massive, brilliant savings in cost and avoidable spend. And that was a national story. And it just mushroomed from there. And I was absolutely I was a zealot for the role of the software in healthcare. But it was all rooted in, as Liz would remember, it was never rooted in financial language for me. It was always rooted in safety and workforce wellness. And my mantra then was, as it is now, if you look after the safety and welfare of your staff and thereby your patients, the money will sort itself out to a degree, and you'll get the rewards you want because you're making better use, you're making more sensible use of resources premised upon safety. And that was what worked for me. But that, in a nutshell, is the clinical story.
Right. So no, I just think it's important to share that perspective with this conversation, just so people understand where we're coming from. Yeah. And I would also want to add this point to that. So everything that you just described is something I could have never done, right? So when I was growing up, I would say pretty much struggled in school. I had some learning issues and some challenges that I'm sure other people are very familiar with or maybe even have dyslexia and things like that. You know, not extreme, but, you know, it was just harder for me to do things that were very easier. And quite frankly, Darren, people like you really annoyed me because you would just say, well, I barely studied for that test and I got an A. And
that is not the case.
All right.
Now let's disabuse you of that.
I didn't say you. I said
disabuse you of that quickly.
I said people. I said people like you.
I know what you mean.
So I was clear. Okay. So for me, the idea of biology and chemistry and taking MCATs, trying to go to medical school and everything else was just completely, totally not something that was in, you know, my DNA, or at least in my mind. You know, so when I got into healthcare, which is over 30 years ago, I was extremely intimidated. I didn't think I belonged at all. And I had imposter syndrome in a very big way. And about a year into my first job, I worked for actually a British company. It was called ICI. Some of you guys may be familiar with it. It became Zeneca. Now it's known as AstraZeneca. And about a year in, I got moved into the hospital setting and I went in to see probably 200 or 300 surgeries. I spent time in burn units. I spent overnights in ICUs. I got really deep and I loved it. And then I went into consulting. I did operations redesign and strategy consulting for hospitals, what people used to call patient-centered care and patient-focused care. Re-engineering was a term that was big in the 90s. And the thing that amazed me was that so many people who were so smart were doing things that weren't so smart. And what I concluded, it wasn't about the people. It was about process. And so when tech started hitting in the late 90s, my epiphany was like, oh man, this is the force multiplier in terms of solving problems. Like you try to educate people all you want, right? You can even put processes in place, but man, if you can automate it out, then you can really scale and solve a problem. So I got involved with nationalizing, really globalizing with the company I was part of, the e-prescribing movement, and then with electronic health records. And so it's kind of, we sit here today, you and I and Liz, and have this conversation. The thing that I reflect on when you're saying what you're saying is, as an individual doctor in the ER, yeah, you can have an impact on, well, not just 10 people, but maybe 100 people that kind of come through in a given day. And then as a CMO for a hospital, well, maybe it's everybody who comes in, or even that community. But when you become part of a tech company, especially one with a heart and a sense of purpose, and also the precision of the kind of work that we're doing, you have a chance to affect care for not just a hospital or a region or a country, but globally. And when I said it's a privilege, that's really what I meant. And I wasn't saying it in a, wow, this sounds great to say kind of way. I actually meant it sincerely, like, wow, how many jobs have that kind of opportunity? Yeah. And that's all it is. I mean, you gotta really be thoughtful, obviously, about whether you're actually solving those problems. And you have to be authentic as to when you're falling short, and be reflective on things that are changing and opportunities to do better in the future. But that's, I think, when we think about this collectively as a group, 2,000 people on our team, that's the opportunity.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. So one of the things that we're discussing through this podcast is how consumer technology has been so intuitive for people, and a conversation that's certainly happening here in the UK at the moment around why healthcare technology needs to follow suit. We can't train everybody in the level of detail that's needed. You have got a lot of experience about how we engage people in our various solutions, and just be interested in your reflections on how we take health tech on a consumer journey.
Yeah, and I'd turn it back to you guys afterwards about how we involve customers in that process. But the benchmark should not be in healthcare. The benchmark should be anywhere and everywhere. So my inspiration through the 90s and then that followed was completely from a design perspective and a human factors perspective from Apple. And just the intuition of everything that they did. And I'm not just talking about application. I mean, the box that they would ship to your house, that you would press a button and everything was already on. You didn't have to load anything. It just worked. And then you saw this time after time with the iPod and the iPhone and the evolution of just radical, maniacal simplicity. And so the mark of real true genius is taking complex things and making them simple. Now, if you think about that, well, what's the most complex thing imaginable? To me, it's healthcare. It really is. I mean, and I describe this to people over and over again in the same exact way, but it's not like a Rubik's Cube. It's more like a 17 by 17 by 17 Rubik's Cube. Like, this is a massive, complicated thing that most people could barely pick up because that's a big Rubik's Cube. And they would look at it and they wouldn't even want to get started. They would just say, boy, it's a mess. And that would be that. Yeah. And the reality is, if you look at what a Rubik's Cube of that size actually is, it's not what you think it is. It's actually a bunch of little Rubik's Cubes inside of it. And you got to work your way out and solve the problem in that fashion. So it's a solvable problem, but it's a solvable set of problems. It's not just one big thing. So people can vilify healthcare and then the different players within it. And that is just so misguided. It's a complicated thing. And in order to make progress, you have to really lean in to those individual problems. You got to geek out on them and you got to love it. And then simplify, 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 simplify. So it makes it easy That's the design problem in healthcare is you got to make it easy for people to do the right thing. That's it. I mean, that is always the case. In a company, a large company, complicated company, what's the game to be played? You got to make it really simple, for people to do hard things.
It's interesting just on that very point, Dan, because how many times was I sort of on the wrong end of technology as a clinician where a product arrived and it seemed like then I had to wrap something in my lived experience of being a clinician around this product rather than the reverse. So you're absolutely right. You spend yourself scratching your head in the team thinking, well, this looks like really great software. What are we going to do with it? It's not quite what we wanted. We can do something with it. I'm sure it's got lots of functionality. I'm not quite sure we understand how to do it. It might help a bit, but it's not helping as much as it could because the product hadn't been led by the need of us as customers.
And Darren, if you go back to the point where you rolled out the workforce technology many years ago, and other people were doing the same as you at the same time and had different results. So what did you do that made that very human-centered at the organization you were at the time?
Well, I'd been inspired in my younger sort of research days by a couple of researchers, sociological researchers called Lev and Wenger, who instilled a notion of what was called a community of practice in the early 90s. They're still around, and it was a seminal piece of work for me. And so when we adopted the software and wanted to fully embed it in the workforce, I saw it as almost a human thing. It sounds a bit bonkers. I saw the software and the technology as almost another human colleague coming in to help us in the team as part of this community of practice. And those who came from allocators was to help us with the implementation would remember these surreal conversations we used to have, where I wanted those guys who came in to help implementation to see themselves as part of our clinical family, as part of the workforce, as part of the community of practice in which I wanted to operate. And so for me, I think the success was due to the fact that I didn't worry about the technological aspects of it, didn't worry about the functionality of it in this respect. It was all around how this new person in the team, this virtual person, could help us to make sense of things and help us to do the right thing and would give us consistency and would give us reproducibility in what we did. And I don't for one moment pretend it wasn't hard. It was really hard. And it was a war of attrition in some respects because as you're putting in this software, you're in an organizationally very complicated, as you say, very busy system, even within one organization. And we put it in the winter, which didn't help, et cetera, et cetera. But that was the key to success for me. It was dealing with problems as they came along, but always in the context of, we've widened our clinical family here to include virtual partners. The software is one of us. And that, I think, was the key to success.
And funnily enough, we're literally just talking about a colleague who helped you do the rollout.
Yes.
And isn't that interesting that you remember the names? This is somebody who's since gone on to have a huge career elsewhere, but the name of the person who was in that team with you still resonates. How are they doing? What's going on? I love that. Yeah.
Years later.
Yeah. Dan, we have talked about AI and the role that's going to play. And I think you've got some really interesting perspectives in terms of not just practically where we can apply it, but what it means the human's role is going to be in the context of that. And I'd love to get your reflections on that in terms of our approach to it as an organization.
Yeah. So there's a saying that people overestimate the impact of a new technology in the short term and not underestimate in the long term. That was true in the 90s, what we were just talking about before with the internet, for sure. So everybody is saying, well, here's why it can't work, and here's how it could solve every single problem in the world, and neither one which was the right path to go down. Because ultimately it was all about use cases and problems, and things evolve over time and things take time. With AI, same thing. Internet was a tool. This is a tool. The question is, how do you use the tool and what problem are you trying to solve with it? So not surprising that people will be initially very, very skeptical and nervous about something as substantial as this. And those people are needed and necessary. That mentality is important. And those conversations are critical. At the same time, you want to have the art of the possible people. And both groups need to talk to each other and acknowledge each other in order to be able to make progress in a way that's significant. So the potential with AI is daunting. And anyone who's walking around presenting or consulting and saying, here's the definitive answer, I would run the opposite way. But if you get down to very specific use cases, there's a lot of great ones in healthcare where you could actually have a very significant impact. And guess what? A lot of those happen to be in the zones that we're in, around workforce, around risk, around safety, around compliance, around governance. It's target rich. And we kind of talk about this. So the front end of healthcare has gotten a little bit easier, even though people don't necessarily love it, and they wouldn't say that they do, but I don't think they would go back in time to when there was a time when there was an electronic health records now. And on the financial side, there's been a fair level of sophistication and automation of the back end of healthcare, but that middle part is messy. So as a company, no question about it, we're a tech company, we're going to be leaning in a thoughtful way, in a very deliberate way, of where we can create leverage for our customers and use this advance to move faster, move in a more targeted fashion, solve problems, guess what, both internally and externally, because you could use it within your company.
Yeah.
But the thing that I reflect on, because there is a lot of fear, is to think of this in a maybe slightly different way, maybe tilt it, and think of AI, the other AI. And so there's artificial intelligence, great. And to some extent that commoditizes the Darrens of the world. But the traditional intelligence, could you read or retain something? Who is the expert that I need to go to define something? That's can become a little bit more of a commodity. But the other AI, which is what I call authentic intelligence, critical thinking, teamwork, empathy, creativity, the things that really you end up valuing in somebody else that you work with, in fact, the things that have the highest correlation to someone being effective as a physician or in business or in anywhere, is ultimately that nimbleness to be an active listener, to be curious, to apply creative problem-solving skills, to be a process-driven person, yes, but somebody who isn't altogether caught up in that is the end point. And that type of rounded intelligence is not something that's well understood or well taught, but you're going to see a very big difference in the future because, once again, think of AI as a tool. Boy, it's a powerful tool. You can do a lot of things with it. The question is, well, what should you do with it? What can you do with it? How will you take those things and mainstream them? Those are things that human factors, because we were talking about that before, will play in heavily. So I'm extremely optimistic, but I wouldn't say I'm just positive. Like positive, we even use this expression internally. And we talked about toxic positivity, like, oh my God, this is going to be the greatest thing ever. And it could solve every problem. Like, I think people like that and thought processes like that, once again, run away from them. But optimism is saying, well, there's something that's a problem and maybe we can make it better. And let's give it a shot. That to me is optimism. So I'm incredibly optimistic about the role that this can play in helping us to solve bigger and more complex problems.
That's really interesting. It chimes to what you hear a lot of these days. Back in my clinical training, and this is an international phenomenon, what you described there was not the way we were trained and taught. But I always see that technology in all its forms now in clinical practice, looking after people is an art and a science, can help with the science to a degree. You can liberate the art to enable people to think widely, to think creatively, and to do different things.
Well, let me lean in on that. Yeah. So like if you have the opportunity to do this when you're younger and get a tutor because you're trying to learn in a more accelerated fashion, you're getting someone who's an expert who can essentially ask you questions and help you reflect on your responses. Well, any kid who's under the age of 17 who's studying for a chemistry test today is on AI and asking it to create a Quizlet for them and now has an automated tuner. Now, like, think about that. For all the kids who could have afforded it before and their families, they had that privilege. But now everybody does for free. That is amazing. So think of that as a very specific use case. How could someone argue against that? So let's not talk in generalities about AI. Let's get down into the mud and talk about real things. And that's where I think the real value and the real promise of it is.
Yeah.
That's all right. And So I think that links us through to, so as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about a doctor who got in touch with me via our corporate Twitter account when it was called Twitter some years ago to explain about the way our software was built because he was dyslexic. I've stayed in contact with him ever since. Really interesting guy. And he didn't want to talk about it openly in his own organisation because that wasn't a conversation that was easy to have in his organisation. And he was talking about literally the screens, the way in which things were built and discovered, and thinking about the way in which AI is going to help us as an organisation also understand our different users. You mentioned something earlier on, Dan, about how are we going to get closer to customers and use the community of customers to help us design in this new world. And I just wondered if you'd got examples that you've seen that you admire of that in the world and what you think the potential is in our organization.
Yeah, well, I would encourage you and Darren to give examples of how we're doing it today. So one example is, let's say a customer has a very specific requirement in something that they want us to do. So the answer could be yes, but it turns out the better answer is probably no. Or, you know what? Let me reflect on that and find 5 to 10 to 20 other organizations who have that same need and then come back to you. Because if you end up doing N of 1 development for an individual customers, guess what? I'm not just doing it for you. That means I'm doing it with everybody. And that doesn't create collective lift. So sometimes people are very intangible about customer input. This is what we do, and it's a feel good.
Yeah.
But when you really get specific about, well, hold on here. There's a saying we used at my last company, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And there's a lot of that in a company, right? The loudest voice, the loudest customer, the list goes on. And there's also the tyranny of the now. So you've got a lot of things. You got someone who's really unhappy and they're raising all kinds of issues. So once again, you need to kind of dial that down a little bit and pull that back. And even if the answer is no or not now, that might be okay. But an answer is better than, well, we'll see, and then not getting back.
Yeah.
Or yes, and then it turns out the answer is, well, we're one release later, or 1 year later, now it may not happen at all. And those things are very, very easy to happen because people have relationships. They have people like Darren who have like a wonderful perspective and are engaged maybe as a customer, and you want to please them and be responsive to them. So you got to pull back and really leverage a community. And that's why I think we need to talk about this more broadly, but a community of customers. So you just don't have that single voice, because you might have a very influential organization or person who's leaning hard on you, but that may be the totally wrong decision.
Yeah. And we've seen that happen a lot in our organization. I've seen it happen in other organizations. I think, what are your thoughts in terms of the fact that as a global organization, we talk a lot about intimacy with customers and being local and getting very close to it. There is something about the fact that if you're going to get a group of cardiologists together, then they can be from anywhere. If you're going to get a group of advanced nurse practitioners, then it doesn't matter where they are. They're going to have something that they've got as commonality. Do you think that's something we should be doing more of?
Yes and no, because I do think healthcare is hyper-local. So I think there's a role for that. And I do think that's a growth opportunity for clinicians to connect them globally. But I would say that the use cases in one country and also the reputation of an organization doesn't necessarily translate into somewhere else, because you do look for thought leadership and you do develop trust around that thought process. And so I do think that has a role in terms of professional growth and development and also reflection. But I think you need to be nimble. I think you do need to do more of the local and then bring that other perspective in, because it may cause others to say, maybe we shouldn't do it that way. I mean, we're in over 20 countries. I mean, that is leverage, and that's a wonderful thing. We're in over 6,000 organizations. That is leverage, and that's a really good thing. But it's kind of like AI or the internet. It's not the answer for everything. And just because you are doesn't mean it's relevant to other people. So I often say, like, when you're running a company like ours, you don't have 2,000 people, you have 2,000 individuals. And your opportunity is to help them grow and ensure that that's helping the company grow.
Mhm.
But in order to do that, you have to provide direction and all the general things that you need to do. But you also have to get down to a ground level of what each individual person is contributing and doing in that organization. So I think if you're going to make an impact on things, you have to think in macro sense, but also in a micro sense. So that's how I would think about that.
And because you've been here these 8 days now, we've been really lucky to have you in the UK, and you've been lucky to meet so many customers. And you've worked globally, and you've worked in the UK healthcare many times before. But over the last sort of 8 days, what have you learned about our customers that surprised you?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I don't think it's surprised me. I would say that it's very clear that our customers want us to do well. It's very clear that they care about the work that they're doing and they see us as a partner in that. It's also clear that there's more we can and should be doing as a company. And if you were to kind of say it in the frame that you were using before, and I think this kind of gets to the macro versus the micro, there are significant differences in healthcare delivery in different countries and in different regions of different countries and in different hospitals within the same region.
Yeah.
And this is zoom out, zoom in, pull out that accordion and push it back in, true everywhere in the world. And so the important thing is kind of going back to the customer input perspective. You really, really need people like Darren, you, and Liz, you, who are really good at listening in order to get the level of precision in terms of the products and services that you provide on anything, much less in healthcare. So that's why I do think this podcast series is important, because these are super important topics that, in my experience, call it a postmortem. It's better to scale postmortems than just to have it in one institution on one day in one room with one group of people. So I do think that there's so much that could be learned from good and best practices, but also bad and lessons learned. So in many ways, you want to combine postmortems with premortems and reflect on the problems that we have right now, the risk that's associated with them, the different pressure on workforce and those who lead organizations, both clinically and financially right now, and be mindful that, boys, are things changing quick right now? The speed of change has accelerated greatly. So by bringing these kind of conversations forward, both with our team and hearing what we have to say, and more importantly for our customers and healthcare providers and the challenges that they're facing, it's super important to take these vignettes, and podcasts are a great way to do it, and just get that to people, make it more accessible. So I really would applaud what we're trying to get done here, but know and understand that if others can promote it and push it and pull it along, we're only going to get more leverage from it, and would invite people who want to participate and join on the conversation to do just that.
Yeah, it's
Absolutely.
been some of the conversations so far. I mean, one of the revelations for me in the last couple of weeks has been that I've sat in countless conferences where people have said the next generation don't want to be in medicine forever. They want a portfolio career. They're probably thinking about doing, maybe 10 years and then they'll do something else. And every single person we've met and spoke to so far has had a portfolio career. But it's so interesting.
So I know we're running on time, but I just do want to react to that. That is something we should all take extremely personally and acknowledge the reality of that.
Yeah.
And so we collectively as an industry need to turn that around. And it's super, super important, because I guarantee you this generation is more conscious of wanting to make an impact in this world than any generation before. So we have to set this world of healthcare up as an innovation platform where we need the brightest minds, and we have to open that door for them to be creative and in many ways bring that creative friction and ensure that it's not just who, I've been in healthcare for 30 years. Let's have two people who've been there, done that, talk about the problems that we have and think about ways that we can make it better. That's an important conversation. Great. But in that room, there should be a bright, ambitious 20-year-old who's asking all of the right questions, like, why would you do it that way? Because inertia is the most powerful force in healthcare. And that's important to understand. We're most likely to do exactly what we did yesterday, and you need a catalyst to push against that. And that's really important to understand. And the thing that's missing most in healthcare right now, and it speaks to this problem, is trust. And we need to lean into that together as an industry to make this oh my God, how could you not want to work in healthcare? We should be offended by that. So anyways, that's the final thing that I would say is this is not a problem, even though I just laid it out as such. It's an amazing opportunity for us to just, hey, we got through some really hard times. There's hard times ahead, but let's get excited and engaged about what we could do next from here and zero base it and re-energize and rethink the future we want to create for our children and those that come next.
That's so true. And it actually plays, I know we are out of time, but it plays to conversations we've had before in terms of the collective responsibility we have, all of us involved in healthcare, from software through to frontline staff, so that when you are in college or high school or coming out of wherever education you're in, it's the go-to career, because there's so much potential, so much promise, so much reward.
Yeah. And that is something we can absolutely do together. It's so exciting. What I might do is when we've done a few more of these and when you're back over this side of the pond, we might bring a few folks back together when this has been out in the wild, Dan, and have some more conversations. That's really useful.
I was only going to say it's been great to have you on the podcast, Dan. Thank you very much. The first of several, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's been really illuminating and very rewarding. Thank you.
I think it's been great. Thank you both for sharing as well stories. We are involved in a personal business. And so we have to know who we're working with, and our customers want to know who we are.
I've really enjoyed getting to know you guys and the rest of the team, and we're going to do great things from here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of The Connection. We hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights on the role that both technology and people play within the healthcare landscape. For more information and resources, visit RLDatix.com. Don't forget to subscribe to The Connection on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast platform you use. Join us next time as we continue to explore how healthcare is impacted by connecting people and technology. On behalf of the RLDatix team, thanks for listening.